The longest night of the year is a fragile truce. For millennia, our ancestors understood that the return of the sun was not a guarantee. It was a victory, earned against a siege of darkness and cold. And so, to survive the siege, they gave the darkness a face. They populated the frozen world with hunters in the sky, with horned enforcers of a brutal winter law, and with terrifying matrons who judged the living from the shadows. We call them monsters, we call them demons, but they were something else. They were a necessary part of the story, a shadow that gives the firelight its meaning. To understand the origins of winter's horrors, we must first understand the central anxiety of the ancient world. This was the fear of a universe dying. For our ancestors, the sun was the source of all life, its daily journey across the sky a reaffirmation of cosmic order. Its warmth was the barrier against chaos, its light the shield against the things that moved in the dark. This relationship was one of intimate and desperate observation. Humanity built monuments of stone and earth, vast astronomical clocks designed to answer a single, terrifying question: will the light return? Each autumn, the sun's arc grew shorter and weaker. Each day, the shadows grew longer. The world grew colder. This was the sun's annual sickness, a slow withering that culminated in the solstice, the longest and most dreadful night of the year. In a world without electric light, the coming of this darkness was absolute. It was a physical presence, a form of sensory deprivation that transformed the familiar world into a hostile and alien landscape. The forest at the edge of the village, a place of resources and sustenance by day, became a source of latent menace by night. The path to a neighbor's home became a journey fraught with peril. This darkness was the tyranny of winter. It dictated the rhythms of life, forcing communities into a state of semi-hibernation. It confined families to their homes, small spaces filled with the smoke of the hearth, the smell of preserved food, and the oppressive weight of the world outside. The night was a siege, and every home was a fragile fortification against it. It was in this profound, suffocating blackness that the human imagination did its most formative work. The sounds of the winter world, the howl of the wind, the crack of a frozen tree branch, the cry of a nocturnal animal were given shape and form. The anxieties of the community, the fears of starvation, isolation, and death were projected out into the darkness. They were given names, faces, and terrible agency. The physical confinement of winter was mirrored by a fundamental economic anxiety. With the fields frozen and the forests impassable, every community became an isolated island, forced to survive solely on what it had stored. The larder became the most important room in the house, its contents the measure of a family's foresight and virtue. Each meal was a calculated depletion of a finite resource, a daily reckoning with the specter of starvation. This constant, low-level fear bred a unique social dynamic. In small, close-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. The gaze of the neighbor became a pervasive force of social regulation. Prudence, hard work, and piety served a dual function, acting as both private virtues and essential public demonstrations of worthiness. A family that had planned well was a stable part of the community. A family that was lazy or wasteful was a future burden, another mouth to feed from a collective supply that might not be enough. This intense internal pressure was matched by the terror of external isolation. To be caught outside after dark, To be trapped between settlements by a sudden storm was often a death sentence. The world beyond the village walls possessed an active hostility that transcended mere emptiness. This physical reality reinforced a deep-seated psychological need for communal safety. To be a part of the community was to be safe within the firelight. To be cast out was to be thrown to the mercy of the cold and the dark. This dynamic created the perfect crucible for a morality enforced by fear. The community's survival depended on a rigid social order, and the long, idle nights of winter provided ample time to scrutinize the behavior of one's neighbors. The sins of an individual were seen as a threat to the entire group. Laziness, impiety, and greed were cracks in the village's defenses against the overwhelming power of winter. It was this intense, judgmental gaze that would soon be given a supernatural form. The final layer of winter's tyranny was metaphysical. In the ancient and medieval worldview, the physical decay of the world was inextricably linked to its spiritual state. The withering of the sun, the great confinement, and the ever-present threat of death were seen as symptoms of a tear in the fabric of reality. This was a liminal time, a sacred and dangerous period that exists outside the normal flow of the calendar, when the normal laws of the universe were suspended. This belief held that the barrier, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits, grew thin and permeable during the deepest part of winter. The solstice was the epicenter of this phenomenon. With the sun at its weakest and the darkness at its most powerful, the gateways to the other world were thrown open. The dead could walk the earth, and the far older spirits of nature, entities neither good nor evil, could wander freely from the forests and mountains into the lands of humankind. This was a literal belief, and it dictated human behavior. The danger was twofold: the physical threat of the blizzard and the supernatural horrors it might conceal. Doors were barred and shutters were locked to keep out more than just the cold. To travel at night during the Yuletide season was to risk an encounter with forces beyond human comprehension. It was a time for absolute stillness, a time to remain close to the hearth, the sacred, protective center of the home. This belief system created a world saturated with supernatural possibility. The howl of the wind was the cry of a restless spirit. A strange track in the snow was the sign of an unseen visitor. The sudden death of livestock was the work of a malevolent entity. The darkness was no longer empty, it was watching. This trifecta of fear, the cosmic anxiety for the sun, the societal pressure of confinement, and the metaphysical terror of a world overrun by spirits, created the perfect psychological conditions for the birth of monsters. From the crucible of winter's fear, the first entity to emerge was a storm. It was a terror born not in the home, but in the sky. Across the vast sweep of Germanic, Nordic, and even British folklore, it was known by many names: the Furious Host, the Asgard Hunt, Odin's Ride. But its essence was always the same. It was the Wild Hunt. The phenomenon began with a sound. It was often mistaken at first for a winter gale, the familiar howl of wind through the trees. But it would grow in intensity, resolving itself into something deeply unnatural. It was the baying of 1,000 hounds where there were no hounds. It was the blast of a hunting horn from the heart of a storm cloud. It was the cacophony of a spectral army on the move, a sound that chilled the soul and promised ruin. To be caught outside during its passage was the ultimate peril. The witness would see the clouds themselves take shape, twisting into the forms of monstrous hounds and spectral horsemen. They were a hunting party of the dead, a furious cavalcade charging across the heavens in pursuit of some unknown, spectral quarry. They moved with the speed of the storm itself, an unstoppable force of nature and supernature fused into one. At their head rode a formidable, commanding figure, a king of the damned, a spectral huntsman whose identity shifted with the culture telling the tale. In some traditions, he was a local sinner, a nobleman cursed to hunt for all eternity. But in the oldest layers of the myth, in the deep memory of the Germanic and Norse peoples, he was something far more formidable. He was an echo of an old god, a winter phantom of the All-Father, Woden. The hunt was a tangible presence. Those who survived an encounter told of being swept up in its wake, of being chased for miles, of losing their sanity from the sheer terror of the sight. The passage of the hunt was a physical violation of the human world. It was said that where the hunt passed, the land itself was scarred. Fences would be inexplicably broken, livestock found dead from fright, and strange, otherworldly tracks found in the morning snow. This was the core function of the wild hunt. It was the ultimate personification of the winter storm. It took the chaotic, impersonal violence of the wind and the blizzard and gave it a face, a will, and a terrifying purpose. The storm was no longer a random act of nature. It was a spectral army with a dark king at its head, and its passage through the night sky was a direct and terrifying intrusion of the spirit world into the affairs of the living. The identity of the spectral rider is the key to understanding the hunt's significance. The figure known as Woden to the Germanic tribes was the same being the Norse peoples called Odin, the All-Father, the chief deity of the pre-Christian pantheon. Odin's divine portfolio was vast and complex, but several of his key functions align perfectly with the mythology of the hunt. First and foremost, he was a psychopomp, a conductor of souls. He was the god who chose which warriors would die in battle and who would be granted a place in his hallowed hall of Valhalla. This host of his chosen slain, the Einherjar, can be seen as the mythological prototype for the furious host that follows the hunt's leader. The wild hunt, in this original context, is a procession of the honored dead, led by the very god who selected them. This connection explains the military and aristocratic character of the hunt, its depiction as a noble, albeit terrifying, cavalcade. It was a manifestation of the pagan warrior cult, a belief system where a glorious death in battle was the ultimate aspiration, and Odin was the ultimate arbiter of that fate. Odin's second crucial aspect was his role as the god of ecstasy and frenzy. His very name is derived from the Old Norse word Oda, which translates to fury, inspiration, and madness. He was the patron of the berserkers, warriors who entered a trance-like state of uncontrollable rage in battle. This divine madness, this terrifying and chaotic energy, is the very essence of the wild hunt. The hunt is the storm, and the storm is pure, untamable chaos. Odin, as the master of this sacred frenzy, is its perfect leader. The howling of the wind is his battle cry. The chaos of the blizzard is the fury of his berserkers made manifest in the sky. The wild hunt is his divine madness writ large across the winter landscape. It is a force that operates entirely outside the bounds of human law and reason. When Christianity arrived in Northern Europe, It faced the immense challenge of supplanting a figure as deeply embedded as Odin. The church employed a strategy known as euhemerism, the process of demoting the old gods. A deity could be reinterpreted as a historical human king, an ancestor, or, most commonly, a demon. Odin underwent this exact transformation. The god who once led the honored dead across the sky was reframed as a devil leading a host of the damned. His sacred procession was recast as a hellish punishment, his divine ecstasy reframed as sinful, demonic rage. The Wild Hunt is the ghost of Odin, the persistent folkloric memory of a primordial pagan god, too potent to be erased, who was instead transformed into a terrifying spectre that would haunt the Christian imagination for 1,000 years. The spectral leader was only one half of the terror. The other was the host that followed him, the source of the hunt's chaotic noise. In the original pagan context, these followers were Odin's Einherjar, the souls of his chosen warriors, engaged in a glorious, eternal ride. But as the memory of the old gods faded and was reshaped by Christian cosmology, the identity of this host grew darker and more varied. It became a terrifying catalogue of the lost. The host was primarily composed of the restless dead. This included the souls of those who had died violently, suicides, the unbaptized, and women who had died in childbirth. According to folk belief, these were souls who existed in a terrible limbo, unable to find peace in the afterlife, and denied entry to heaven. They were trapped between worlds, and the passage of the Wild Hunt acted as a form of spiritual gravity, sweeping up these unmoored souls into its furious, eternal procession. Their danger to the living was existential. The risk was not of physical attack, but of spiritual assimilation. It was believed that a mortal who looked upon the hunt, or who was foolish enough to cry out to them, could have their soul pulled from their body. This mortal spirit would then be forced to join the furious host, doomed to ride with them across the sky until the end of time. This belief reinforced the absolute necessity of hiding, of barring the doors and averting one's gaze. In regions with strong Celtic influence, like parts of Britain and France, the identity of the host took on a different character. Here, the riders were often identified as the fair folk, or the Easshi of Gaelic tradition. These were not the diminutive, benevolent fairies of later Victorian fancy. They were the original elves, powerful, amoral, and deeply dangerous supernatural beings who were said to inhabit a parallel world. In this context, the Wild Hunt was the procession of the fairy aristocracy sweeping across the land on a royal hunt. Their passage served as a stark reminder that the human world was built on top of a much older, magical landscape. The hunt provided a potent supernatural explanation for a common and tragic occurrence. When a person, particularly a child, vanished without a trace in the wilderness during winter, they were said to have been taken by the hunt or stolen by the fairies. This narrative provided a form of terrible closure, transforming a random tragedy into an act of mythic significance. Whether it was a host of the dead or a cavalcade of fairies, the core concept remained the same. The furious host represented a population of beings who existed outside the bounds of the Christian world and its promise of salvation. They were a terrifying army of the lost, the damned, and the other, a stark and visible reminder of the spiritual dangers that saturated the winter darkness. The Wild Hunt was more than a terrifying spectacle. It was an omen. Its passage was a message from the other world, a direct and terrifying form of prophecy. For the pre-modern mind, the universe was a coherent, interconnected web of signs and symbols. A storm in the sky could be a direct reflection of coming turmoil on the earth. The hunt was the most dire of these portents, a supernatural announcement of impending doom. Its appearance was said to herald the most cataclysmic societal calamities. The primary fear was war. The sight of Odin's spectral army in the sky was a sure sign that a terrestrial army would soon be on the march. It also foretold the death of royalty. The passing of a great king or queen was a moment of immense instability, and the hunt's ride was seen as the supernatural echo of that coming disruption. Crucially, this belief is cemented in the historical record. The most famous account comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, specifically a version known as the Peterborough Chronicle. In the year 1127, the chronicler describes a vision of a huge and black huntsman with a pack of black and broad-eyed hounds, witnessed by many reliable men. The account explicitly frames this supernatural event as a portent of the turmoil that followed, a sign of the troubles afflicting the land. Beyond war and the death of kings, the hunt was also linked to plague. In a world with no concept of germ theory, a sudden, inexplicable wave of death that swept through a community could only be understood as a supernatural event. The hunt provided a narrative framework. Its foul, otherworldly breath was believed to carry pestilence, and to see it pass over your village was to be marked for death. This prophetic function reveals the hunt's deeper psychological purpose. It served as a way to impose a form of terrible meaning onto the chaotic and often senseless tragedies of the world. A random crop failure or a sudden plague is a terrifying, nihilistic event, but a disaster that has been announced by a great and terrible omen is part of a cosmic drama. It suggests that the affairs of humanity are so significant that they are mirrored in the heavens. Believing the wild hunt was a portent gave a community a sense of agency, however small. It provided a warning. It allowed for prayers, rituals, and preparations. It transformed the victims of a random universe into participants in a mythic struggle. Thus, the wild hunt stands as the ultimate personification of the winter storm's many terrors. It embodies the physical violence of the gale, the supernatural threat of the thinning veil, the memory of the old gods, and the terrifying promise of future doom. It is the great, foundational horror of the winter sky, an echo of a pagan world that would reverberate through the European imagination for centuries, setting the stage for the more intimate, earthbound monsters who would soon emerge from the shadows. While the wild hunt haunted the skies of Europe, a different kind of terror was taking root in the isolated valleys of the Alps. This was an intimate horror, one that left the wilderness and came to the very door of the family home. He is the most famous of all Europe's dark winter traditions, a figure of horn, fur, and chain. He is Krampus. His appearance is an unforgettable amalgam of the human and the beast. The shaggy fur, the cloven hooves, and the great, curling horns immediately evoke a sense of pre-Christian antiquity. This powerful imagery is the foundation of the most popular theory of his origin, that Krampus is a direct survival, a folkloric fossil of a pagan horned god of nature who once roamed these same mountains. This theory connects him to a wide family of ancient deities, from the satyrs, who followed the Greek god Pan, to the horned god Kernanos, depicted on the Gundestrup cauldron of the Celts. In this interpretation, Krampus is the winter aspect of the wild, a personification of the untamed natural world that Christianity sought to suppress. His annual rampage is a memory of old rituals, a brief, chaotic resurgence of a pagan world that refuses to be forgotten. This pagan survival theory is incredibly compelling, but it is also the subject of intense scholarly debate. Modern folklorists point to a critical lack of evidence. There are no surviving records from the pre-Christian or early medieval era that describe a figure like Krampus. The myth, as we know it, seems to appear in the historical record much later. The prevailing scholarly view is that Krampus is a post-medieval invention. His appearance, instead of being a direct echo of a pagan god, was likely borrowed from a more immediate source, the standardized iconography of the Christian devil. In the late medieval period, religious mystery plays were common, often featuring a theatrical devil to frighten the populace into piety. This figure was almost universally depicted with horns, fur, hooves, and a long tongue. It is highly probable that the figure of Krampus was created by applying this pre-existing image of the devil to local Alpine folk traditions. Specifically, he appears to be a demonization and specialization of the masked figures from the Perchtenlauf, the older rituals designed to drive out winter spirits. This makes Krampus a more complex and perhaps more fascinating figure. This reveals his more complex and fascinating nature. He is a syncretic being, born from the collision of ancient folk ritual and Christian theology. He is the shadow of the wild, but a shadow that has been filtered through the lens of the devil, created to serve a new and specific purpose in the Christian moral landscape. To understand how the feral spirit of Krampus was harnessed, we must first introduce his master. Saint Nicholas of Myra was a 4th century Greek bishop, famed for his piety and secret gift-giving. By the medieval period, he had become one of Christianity's most beloved saints, the patron of children, and the centerpiece of a gift-giving festival on the evening of December 5th, the eve of his feast day. As his legend grew, Saint Nicholas took on the role of a divine judge. He would visit the homes of children, carrying a great book in which all their deeds, good and bad, were recorded. The virtuous and obedient would receive gifts of apples, nuts, and sweets. The disobedient and sinful would receive a lecture and a lump of coal. This created a theological problem. Saint Nicholas was a figure of absolute benevolence and sanctity. It was inconsistent with his character for him to carry out the harsh physical punishments that medieval society deemed necessary for true discipline. The saint could threaten, but he could not strike. For the system to be effective, he needed an assistant, a subordinate who could handle the dirty work. This need gave rise to the tradition of St. Nicholas's companions, a host of figures who appeared across the Germanic regions of Europe. In some parts of Germany, it was Belsnickel, a figure clad in furs. In others, it was Knecht Ruprecht, or farmhand Rupert. These figures were intimidating and earthly, tasked with carrying the switches and threatening the misbehaving children on the saint's behalf. In the southern Alpine regions of Austria and Bavaria, this companion role was filled by Krampus. This was the moment of his taming. The chaotic pre-Christian energy of the horned figure was captured, bound in symbolic chains, and forced into the service of the church. He was no longer a spirit of the untamed wild. He was now a supernatural enforcer of Christian morality. This partnership created a perfect and terrifyingly effective system of social control. St. Nicholas was the benevolent face of the church's authority, offering rewards and salvation. Krampus was the muscle. He represented the very real threat of physical punishment and damnation that underpinned that authority. He was the answer to the question, what happens if I disobey? The duality was the key to its power. It presented a complete and inescapable moral universe. There was no escaping judgment. The divine was watching, and it had both a carrot and a very, very big stick. One figure offered gifts from a sack, the other threatened to put you in a sack and carry you away. This act of syncretism was a masterstroke of cultural assimilation. It took a potentially subversive pagan remnant and gave it a job within the Christian narrative. The beast was put on a leash. This transformation cemented Krampus's place in alpine folklore, ensuring his survival by making him an indispensable part of the region's most important winter celebration. The partnership with St. Nicholas gave Krampus a clear and terrifying job description. While the saint handled the interviews and reviewed the children's deeds, Krampus was the arm of enforcement, equipped with a specific set of tools for his grim work. His approach was announced by the clatter of iron chains and bells, a sound that served a dual purpose. It was both a literal warning of his arrival and a symbolic echo of his bondage to the saint, the sound of a leashed monster. His primary instrument of punishment was the ruten, a bundle of birch branches. The threat was simple and direct, a thrashing for misbehavior. Yet the birch rod also carried a deeper, pre-Christian significance. In many pagan folk rituals, striking a person or an animal with branches was a form of sympathetic magic, a way to transfer life force and ensure fertility. Krampus's switch, therefore, is a perfect example of syncretism, a pagan symbol of life repurposed into a Christian instrument of pain. For the truly wicked, a simple thrashing was insufficient. Krampus's most terrifying threat was the sack he carried on his back. Children were told that if their sins were great enough, he would stuff them into the sack, bind it shut, and carry them away from their home. The destination varied with the telling of the tale. Some said he would haul them to his lair in the mountains to be eaten. Others, that he would throw them into a freezing river or take them directly to hell. This system of punishment was a powerful tool for reinforcing the parental authority that was seen as the bedrock of the community. Krampus was, in effect, a supernatural contractor hired by parents to enforce their will. The terror he inspired was a direct and potent lesson in the consequences of defying the family hierarchy. Crucially, however, the jurisdiction of Krampus extended beyond the misdeeds of children. His presence was a warning to the entire household. He was the physical manifestation of the neighbor's gaze we discussed earlier, an outside arbiter of the community's moral standards. His judgment was a reflection of the village's judgment. The visit from St. Nicholas and Krampus was a public performance of a family's virtue. A household that received only gifts from the saint had proven its piety and diligence for all to see. A household that received a loud, violent, and disruptive visit from Krampus was publicly shamed. It was a clear sign that this family was failing to uphold the rigid social order required to survive the winter, and their sins, whether they were laziness, impiety, or discord, were now a matter of public record. The figure of Krampus is kept alive not just in stories, but in a living, breathing, and terrifying folk ritual known as the Krampuslauf, or Krampus Run. Every December, in towns and villages across the Alps, the domestic enforcer is unleashed onto the streets. This is a tradition passed down through generations, with local clubs or Passen taking immense pride in the craftsmanship of their costumes. The masks, or larven, are the heart of this tradition. They are hand-carved from pine or linden wood and fitted with the real horns of goats, rams, or ibex. They are unique works of art, each with its own personality, designed to be genuinely terrifying. The costumes are made from heavy sheep or goat pelts, and the belts are strung with massive, loud bells, designed to create a deafening cacophony. To become Krampus is a serious and often deeply spiritual undertaking for the young men of these communities. On the night of the run, the sanitized world of the modern Christmas market is shattered. The air fills with the smell of wood smoke, alcohol, and sulfur. The deafening, rhythmic clang of bells announces the arrival of the horde. Then, they emerge from the darkness. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of Krampus figures, running through the streets with torches held high. Their dark, hairy forms a stark contrast to the clean white snow. The Krampuslauf is a form of interactive street theatre, a ritualized explosion of controlled chaos. The performers charge the crowds, rattling their chains and thrashing their birch rods against railings and the ground. They single out spectators, roaring in their faces, acting out their traditional role as enforcers of social order. It is a loud, smoky, and genuinely intimidating spectacle, a deliberate and welcome injection of darkness into the festive cheer. This ritual serves a vital modern function. It is a defiant assertion of a unique regional identity in the face of a globalized, homogenized Christmas. It is a cathartic release, a safe and structured way for the community to engage with its own shadow, to externalize and confront the darkness of the season in a celebratory way. It is crucial to differentiate this ritual from the Perchtenlauf. The Krampuslauf is tied specifically to St. Nicholas's Eve around December 5th. Its primary function, inherited from its folkloric origins, is a moral one: to threaten and symbolically punish human misbehavior. The Perchtenlauf, as we shall see, is a different ritual that occurs later in the season, with the distinct magical purpose of driving away the evil spirits of winter itself. The enduring popularity of the Krampuslauf demonstrates the power of this figure. He has survived demonization by the Church, ridicule by the Enlightenment, and outright bans by modern governments. He persists because he is still needed. He is the fire and the fury that balances the sweetness and light of the holiday, a necessary monster who reminds us that the longest night of the year still has teeth. If Krampus is the loud, chaotic, and fiery enforcer of the pre-Christmas season, then the Alps are home to another, older, and stranger entity who governs the sacred period that follows. She is the quiet, cold, and implacable inspector of the home. Her name is Perchta. While Krampus is a leashed beast, Perchta is a sovereign force, a winter hag whose origins reach back to the deepest layers of Germanic paganism. She is the matron of a very specific and supernaturally charged period. The 12 days of Christmas, the time between the solstice and the festival of Epiphany on January 6th. In German folklore, these are the Rauhnächte, the rough nights. This is a time outside of time, a liminal seam in the calendar when the wild hunt rides. The restless dead are closest, and the veil to the other world is at its thinnest. During this period, Perchta was believed to wander the mortal world. She was a spectral inspectress, a supernatural matriarch who moved from home to home, checking that the sacred laws of this uncanny period were being upheld. Her appearance was that of an old, haggard woman, often with one large, strange foot, sometimes called a goose or swan foot, a feature that folklorists believe is a marker of a shape-shifting, otherworldly being. Her most prominent feature, described with terrifying consistency in the folklore, was her knife. Tucked into her skirts, she was said to carry a great, sharp blade, reserved for a very specific kind of punishment. Perchta was the enforcer of domestic taboos, and her judgment was far more intimate and gruesome than a simple thrashing from Krampus's birch rods. Like the Wild Hunt's connection to Odin, Perchta is widely believed by scholars to be the folkloric ghost of a pre-Christian goddess. She is the dark winter aspect of a figure known in southern Germany as Frau Holder or Holle, a sovereign deity who presided over women, domestic arts like spinning, and the souls of unbaptized children. As a goddess, she was a protector of spinners. But after the church transformed her into a demonic hag, her role was inverted, and she was reframed as a hellish witch. The central taboo of the 12 days, the one Perchta was most concerned with, was the prohibition on spinning. All spinning wheels had to be stopped. All work on the loom had to cease. This was a sacred pause, a time when the turning of the wheel of the year was mirrored by the stillness of the spinning wheel in the home. To continue this work was to defy the sacred rhythm of the cosmos. It was an act of profound disrespect, and it was this sin that would call Perchta and her knife to your door. The law of the Rauhnächte was absolute, and Perchta was its unwavering executioner. For those who broke the taboo and dared to spin during the 12 holy nights, the punishment was one of the most gruesome in all of European folklore. Perchta would appear in their home, unannounced and unstoppable. She would take up her great knife and she would slit their bellies open. This was a terrifyingly specific and symbolic act. Having opened the abdomen, she would then pull out the victim's insides and replace them with straw, pebbles, and other refuse. In some versions of the legend, she would even remove the unfinished, illicitly spun flax from the distaff and stuff that into the victim's stomach, a direct and visceral lesson in the consequences of their crime. This punishment is a dark inversion of her pagan origins. As the goddess Holle, she was a patroness of domestic abundance. As the demonized Perchta, she fills the bellies of her victims with trash, a supernatural enforcement of scarcity and a terrifying parody of nourishment. The act transformed the human body into a refuse bin, a potent symbol for a community deeply anxious about the proper management of its finite winter resources. The prohibition on spinning was Perchta's primary concern, but her nightly inspections covered another critical aspect of the 12 days: food. Tradition dictated that a specific meal must be eaten on the eve of Perchta's festival. This meal typically consisted of dumplings and fish. To fail in this observance, to eat a different meal, or to have failed to prepare for this one, was a grave insult. Leaving a portion of this ritual meal out for Perchta and her followers, a practice known as leaving the Perchtan milk, was a crucial act of piety. It was both a sign of respect and a form of offering, a small sacrifice to appease the hungry spirits that roamed during the rough nights. This act demonstrated that the household was well managed, obedient to tradition, and mindful of the supernatural world. For those who failed to prepare the proper meal, the punishment was the same as for the spinners. Perchta would slit their bellies and stuff them with straw. This law reveals her core function. She was the ultimate enforcer of ritual observance. In a world governed by supernatural rules, to deviate from tradition was to invite chaos and disaster. Perchta's authority was absolute in the domestic sphere. She was a reflection of the intense social pressure placed on women, who were responsible for managing the household, the food stores, and the domestic crafts like spinning. She was the personification of the idea that a family's virtue and its very survival depended on the obedience and diligence of its women. Her methods were brutal, but her laws were clear. Honor the sacred rhythms of the cosmos. Keep a clean and orderly home, and above all, eat the proper food. Failure to do so would transform the body itself into a symbol of spiritual and domestic failure, a vessel for the trash that Perchta used to replace a sinner's soul. The figure of the belly slitter is the most sensational and memorable aspect of Perchta, but it represents only half of her identity. To focus solely on her terrifying punishments is to misunderstand her true function. Perchta, like the pre-Christian deities she evolved from, was a figure of essential duality. Her identity transcended that of a simple demon of pure evil. She was a complete system of justice. She was both the bright and the terrible. For the households that honored her laws, that kept a clean home, observed the spinning taboo, and left out the ritual meal, her visit was a blessing. Diligent children and hard-working servants would find a small silver coin in their shoe or in a pail of water the next morning. This was a direct and tangible reward for their virtue, a sign that their piety had been seen and approved of by the supernatural matron of the winter. This dual nature is the key to her ancient power. It reflects a worldview where the forces of nature are themselves dualistic. Winter is a time of death and hardship, but it is also a necessary period of rest and purification that leads to the renewal of spring. Perchta embodies this principle. She brutally prunes the wicked and the lazy from the community, while simultaneously nurturing the diligent and the faithful. The most famous and sanitized version of this benevolent aspect is preserved in the figure of Frau Holle, made famous by the brothers Grimm. The fairy tale tells of two sisters, one industrious and one lazy. The industrious sister falls into Frau Holle's otherworldly realm, works diligently for her, and is rewarded by being showered in gold. The lazy sister follows, refuses to work, and is punished by being drenched in sticky black pitch. Frau Holle and Perchta are two sides of the same coin, the same folkloric entity viewed through different lenses. Frau Holle is the bright, storybook version, her punishments messy but non-lethal. Perchta is the dark, visceral, and terrifyingly real version who haunted the long winter nights. But their core function is identical. They are both supernatural arbiters of domestic virtue, specifically feminine virtue. This dual system of reward and punishment made Perchta a far more effective tool of social control than a simple monster ever could be. Pure terror can lead to paralysis, but a system that offers a clear path to reward encourages active participation. It gives the community a sense of agency. By following the rules, by being clean, pious, hard-working, and observant of tradition, one could both avoid a gruesome fate and actively court prosperity. Perchta's law, therefore, functioned on a higher level than a simple list of prohibitions. It was a complete guide to surviving the physical and spiritual dangers of winter, a guide enforced by a goddess's ghost who carried both a silver coin and a sharpened knife. Perchta's influence extends beyond the home and into the streets, in a ritual that is often confused with the Krampus run, but is fundamentally different. This is the Perchtenlauf, the Perchten run. As we previously established, this procession has a distinct purpose. It happens later in the season, during the 12 days of Christmas, and its function is not to enforce human morality, but to wage a magical war on the malevolent spirits of winter itself. The key to the Perchtenlauf is its division into two distinct groups of figures. The first are the Schiachperchten, the ugly Perchten. These are the chaotic, demonic, and terrifying figures. With their shaggy pelts, carved masks, and loud bells, they are visually almost identical to Krampus figures, and it is from this tradition that Krampus most likely evolved. Their role is to embody the darkness, the frost, and the hostile spirits of the season. They rampage through the town, making as much noise as possible, clanging bells and cracking whips. This cacophony is a form of apotropaic magic, a ritual designed to frighten away unseen evils. They are fighting noise with noise, chaos with chaos. They are the vanguard in the battle against winter's spiritual decay. Following them, or sometimes engaging in mock battles with them, are the Schönperchten, the beautiful Perchten. These figures represent the coming light, the promise of spring, and the eventual victory of the sun. They wear tall, magnificent headdresses, often shaped like crowns or towers, which are intricately decorated with shiny baubles, mirrors, and symbols of good fortune. The mirrors on the headdresses are particularly significant. In European folk magic, mirrors were powerful tools used to deflect evil. The Schönperchten were, in effect, walking talismans, their very presence cleansing the town of the evil spirits stirred up by their ugly counterparts. Their procession is stately and beautiful, a stark contrast to the feral chaos of the Schiachperchten. The Perchtenlauf is a complete magical ritual enacted as street theatre. It is a form of sympathetic magic on a grand scale. The community takes an active role, choosing to ritually and violently drive winter out rather than passively waiting for it to end. The Schiachperchten personify the winter darkness, and the community, through this ritual, symbolically defeats them with the light and good fortune brought by the Schönperchten. This reveals her final, deepest truth. Her roles as an enforcer and a judge are facets of her ultimate identity. She is the personification of winter itself in all its duality. Her ugly followers are the embodiment of the season's life-threatening darkness, while her beautiful followers embody the promise of renewal that lies dormant within it. The Perchtenlauf is her story, a reenactment of the great cosmic battle between dark and light that she oversees. It is a powerful act of communal hope, a declaration that even in the longest night, the community has the power to fight for the return of the sun. While the Alpine peoples engaged with costumed spirits, the Slavic tribes of Eastern Europe waged a more direct war on winter. Their adversary was an ancient and formidable goddess known as Marzana, or Morana. She was the personification of the season's deadliest aspects: the killing frost, the darkness, the plague that festered in the close quarters of winter, and death itself. To ensure the return of spring, the community could not simply wait for Marzana's power to fade. They had to actively kill her. This belief gave rise to a visceral and dramatic folk ritual that has survived in some form to this day. In the final days of winter, the women of the village would gather to create an effigy of the goddess, a physical vessel for all the hardships and misery of the preceding months. The effigy was a life-sized figure made of straw, bound to a wooden frame. It was dressed in a white shroud, the color of both snow and death, but also adorned with the colorful ribbons and finery of a young maiden. This duality was intentional. The effigy represented both the crone of death and the maiden of the coming spring, containing both the life that was and the life that was to come, all of which had to be ritually destroyed for the world to be reborn. On the first day of spring, the entire community would take part in a solemn procession, carrying the effigy of Marzana through the village and out to the nearest river or stream. This was a funeral march for the winter itself. Upon reaching the water, the ritual's violent climax would begin. The effigy would be stripped of its finery, set on fire, and then, while still ablaze, it was cast into the freezing water. This was a potent act of sympathetic magic, using two of the world's most powerful purifying elements. Fire was used to burn away the sickness and decay that Marzana represented, and the living water of the river was used to carry her corpse away, back to the underworld from whence it came, cleansing the land. As the effigy was carried away by the current, a strict taboo was observed. Everyone in the procession had to return to the village without ever looking back. To look back at the drowning witch was to risk calling her curse back upon yourself, to be afflicted with sickness or misfortune for the rest of the year. The return journey was a joyous one, with the villagers carrying freshly cut, evergreen boughs, a tangible symbol of the new life they had just secured. This ritual reveals a fundamentally different psychological approach to the season. The alpine traditions of Krampus and Perchta are largely about appeasement and endurance, of following strict rules to survive the judgment of powerful winter spirits. The drowning of Marzana is an act of magical aggression. It is a proactive, communal assault, a declaration that humanity will not be a passive victim of winter, but will instead rise up to murder the season and drag the spring into the world by force. In the Gaelic traditions of Scotland and Ireland, the personification of winter takes a different form entirely. She represents a different order of being entirely, a primordial and divine entity of immense stature. She is the Cailleach, the Veiled One, the divine hag who is winter itself. She is far older than any saint, a foundational figure from the deepest strata of Celtic mythology. In the Gaelic traditions of Scotland and Ireland, the personification of winter takes a different form entirely. She represents a different order of being entirely, a primordial and divine entity of immense stature. She is the Cailleach, the Veiled One, the divine hag who is winter itself. She is far older than any saint, a foundational figure from the deepest strata of Celtic mythology. Unlike Krampus or Perchta, the Cailleach is a true creator goddess. The folklore credits her with the very formation of the land. It was said that she strode across Scotland, accidentally dropping rocks from her creel or apron, which became the mountains and hills. She built the mountain ranges with her great hammer, herded the deer as her personal flock, and determined the weather with her mood. Her reign began on the festival of Samhain at the end of autumn. On this day, she would travel to a sacred well to wash her great plaid, her tartan cloak. When she pulled it from the water, It was pure white, and as she spread it across the land, it became the first blanket of snow. This act marked the official death of the old year and the beginning of her tyrannical rule. The Kalyak was the absolute personification of the season's harshness. She was the blizzard, the biting wind, the hard frost that killed the crops. Her hammer froze the ground solid. Her breath was the winter gale. To survive her reign was to endure the very worst that nature could throw at the human world. Yet, this relationship was adversarial, not evil. The relationship with the Kalyak was adversarial, yet she was understood as a fundamental and necessary part of the cosmic order. Her reign, while terrible, was understood as a required period of rest for the land. Her frosts killed the pests and purified the soil. Her deep snows would melt and provide the water for the coming year's growth. She was a harsh but essential force. Her reign concluded through a natural and magical transition, a stark contrast to the violent rituals seen elsewhere. On the first day of spring, the festival of Beltane, the Kalyak's power would wane. She would cast her staff beneath a holly or gorse bush, and where it landed, she would transform into a great grey stone, a permanent feature of the landscape, to remain dormant throughout the summer. This worldview presents a more holistic and cyclical understanding of the seasons. This distinguishes her entirely from an outside invader like Marzana. She is the land itself. She is never truly defeated. She just changes her form. Her story shows a deep respect for the formidable power of winter, framing it as a divine and unavoidable force to be endured and understood, rather than a demonic enemy to be aggressively vanquished. From the ancient crags of Scotland, our survey now travels to the sunnier, but no less superstitious, clime of Greece and the Balkans. Here, the winter menace was not a singular divine hag, but a swarming, chaotic horde of goblins. They are the Kalakantsaroi, and they represent a completely different kind of seasonal threat, the eruption of subterranean chaos into the human world. According to folklore, the Kalakantsaroi spend the vast majority of the year underground. Their single malevolent purpose is to soar at the roots of the world tree, the cosmic pillar that holds up the very fabric of creation. They soar, and by the time of the winter solstice, they have almost severed the final root, threatening to plunge the entire universe into ruin. But at the moment of their near victory, a reprieve comes. The solstice marks the birth of Christ, and for the sacred 12 days that follow, the goblins are forced to abandon their work and surface into the mortal world. Their annual destructive project is foiled, and the world tree has time to heal itself. But for humanity, the trouble is just beginning. For these 12 holy nights, the Kalakantsaroi are let loose upon the world, and they exist only to cause mischief and mayhem. They are creatures of chaos, pouring out of caves and streams to invade human homes. They are said to enter through the chimney, a dark inversion of the St. Nicholas legend. Once inside, they cause havoc, souring the milk, extinguishing the hearth fire, tangling the weaving yarn, and generally making a mess of the household. While their mischief was a nuisance, the Kalakantsaroi were considered more dangerous than simple pests. Direct contact could cause sickness or madness. To protect the home, a specific and fascinating set of magical wards were employed. The first was to keep a fire burning in the hearth all 12 nights, as the creatures feared the holy flame. A second, more peculiar ward was to leave a colander on the doorstep. The goblins, being creatures of profound stupidity, were supposedly compelled to try and count the holes. But according to the legend, they were unable to count any number higher than 2. Trapped in a loop of 1, 2, 1, 2, they would be occupied for the entire night, until the crowing of the rooster at dawn would send them fleeing. The final and most potent ward was smell. The jawbone of a pig, hung on the door, was thought to repel them. Even more effective was the burning of a foul-smelling object, typically an old shoe, in the hearth or a brazier outside. The noxious fumes would prevent the goblins from approaching the chimney, sealing their primary invasion route. The story of the Kalikansaroi shows yet another facet of the winter darkness. It is not always a singular, terrifying entity, but can be a chaotic, swarming force of disruption. Their legend transforms the home itself into a magical fortress that must be defended with a unique arsenal of ritual and wit. It is a story of cosmic peril, averted by domestic ingenuity and the simple power of a kitchen utensil. Our survey concludes in the unforgiving landscape of Iceland, a place where the winter darkness is near total and the threat of famine was historically an annual terror. Here, the winter spirits are not mischievous goblins or judges of morality. They are a monstrous family of predators, and their central motivation is a terrifying and insatiable hunger. At the head of this family is their matriarch, Grýla. Mentioned in sources as old as the 13th century prose Edda, Grýla is one of the most fearsome figures in all of European folklore. She is a giant, hideous ogress who lives in a remote mountain cave and descends during the Yule season with one purpose: to hunt and devour misbehaving children. She carries a great sack to haul them away and is said to boil them alive to make her favorite stew. Grýla does not hunt alone. She is accompanied by her monstrous familiar, the Jólakötturinn, or Yule cat. This colossal predatory feline stalks the countryside, peering into the windows of homes. It does not hunt for naughty children, but for those who did not receive new clothes for Yule. This strange tradition was a powerful social incentive. It ensured that all households would work to process the autumn wool harvest before Christmas, a crucial part of the farmstead economy. To be eaten by the Yule cat was the ultimate punishment for a lack of productivity. Completing this dreadful family are Grýla's 13 sons, the Yule lads. In their original folkloric form, these were not the charming pranksters of modern poems. They were Grýla's monstrous offspring, boogeymen who came down from the mountains one by one on the 13 nights leading up to Christmas, their names reflecting their terrifying habits: window peeper, doorway sniffer, and the horrifying meat hook. Like their mother, their original purpose was to steal and eat children. Over the centuries, however, their character underwent a significant transformation. The child-eating monsters were gradually sanitized, evolving into a group of mischievous but largely harmless pranksters, each with a specific, food-related obsession. Skyer Gobbler would steal the yogurt. Sausage Swiper would steal the sausages. They became pests rather than predators. This taming of the Yule lads was a direct result of changing cultural attitudes, a process that can be pinpointed to a specific historical moment. The terrifying legends of Grýla and her sons were so effective at scaring children that in 1746, the government of Iceland, influenced by the rationalism of the Enlightenment, issued a public decree officially banning parents from tormenting their children with these stories. This act marks a crucial turning point, the beginning of a war on winter demons waged not by the church, but by the state. It is a war we will now explore. This Icelandic folkloric family represents the ultimate personification of winter's most fundamental threat. They are not concerned with morality, tradition, or cosmic order. They are hungry. Grilla, her cat, and her monstrous sons are the direct, terrifying embodiment of a community's deepest and most rational fear. The fear of starving to death in the endless, frozen dark. The survival of these ancient figures into the modern era was never guaranteed. For centuries, they were the target of a sustained and systematic campaign of eradication, waged by the most influential institution in Europe, the Christian Church. As Christianity consolidated its power, it could no longer tolerate the existence of these potent, pre-Christian entities. They were a direct challenge to the Church's monopoly on the supernatural. The primary strategy was demonization. This was a more aggressive form of the euhemerism that had demoted Odin into a spectre. Now, the old spirits were recast as something far more dangerous. They were literal demons, servants of Satan sent to lead the faithful astray. The wild hunt was no longer Odin's ride. It was a procession of the damned, led by the devil himself. Perchta was not a winter goddess. She was a hellish witch. This reframing was a matter of theological necessity. The Christian cosmos was a strict dualism of good and evil, God and Satan. There was no room for the morally ambiguous, amoral nature spirits of the old world. A figure like Krampus, with his horns and his connection to the untamed wild, fit perfectly into the pre-existing iconography of the devil. He became a literal demon, his presence a direct manifestation of evil. The war was waged from the pulpit and in the confessional. Priests delivered fiery sermons condemning the old traditions as idol worship. Taking part in a masked procession, like the Perchten Lauf, was reframed from a communal ritual into a mortal sin. Leaving out a food offering for Perchta was no longer an act of piety to a nature spirit, but an act of tribute to a demon, a form of witchcraft punishable by the harshest sanctions. The Church sought to create a deep sense of spiritual fear and shame around the very traditions that had once been essential for surviving the winter. This campaign was exceptionally effective because it preyed upon the deepest anxieties of the populace. In a world where damnation was a very real and terrifying prospect, to be told that your village's beloved traditions were a direct path to hell was a persuasive and terrifying deterrent. The Church's war was a war for the imagination, an attempt to overwrite the ancient folkloric landscape with its own rigid theological map. After centuries of battling the Church's demonization, the old traditions faced a new and even more potent adversary. This was the Age of Enlightenment, the great intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries that championed reason, science, and empirical evidence as the only legitimate sources of truth. For the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the universe was a rational, mechanistic place, a great clockwork set in motion by a divine architect. In this new, brightly lit intellectual landscape, there was no room for the ambiguous, shadowy figures of folklore. The demons and spirits of the old world were subjected to a new kind of attack. They were no longer feared as servants of Satan. They were ridiculed as the products of an ignorant, uneducated, and peasant mind. They were rebranded with a new and powerfully dismissive label: superstition. This intellectual shift was a profound threat to the survival of these traditions. A belief that is feared and opposed by the authorities can still thrive in secret, its forbidden nature giving it a certain power. But a belief that is mocked, that is framed as childish, foolish, and socially embarrassing, begins to wither from within. The urban and educated elites began to distance themselves from these folk practices, viewing them as a mark of backwardness. We have already seen the most concrete and powerful example of this shift in action. The 1746 Icelandic decree that banned parents from frightening their children with tales of Gryla and the Yule Lads is a perfect encapsulation of the Enlightenment mindset. The authorities' motivations were secular, driven by a new psychological concern for the children's rational development, rather than theological concern for their souls. They saw these stories as a form of mental poison, a harmful relic of a darker age that needed to be expunged for society to progress. This was a war for modernization, and the old spirits were its casualties. The war on winter demons continued well past the Age of Reason, evolving from a philosophical debate into a modern political conflict in the 20th century. The figure of Krampus, in particular, was seen as a threat by two very different Austrian governments. In the 1930s, the authoritarian Dollfuss regime, a form of clerical fascism, banned the Krampus tradition. The state viewed the chaotic, pre-Christian elements of the ritual as a form of cultural insubordination that conflicted with their vision of a unified, sanitized national identity. Decades later, in the 1950s, the post-war government again tried to suppress the tradition. This time, the attack was psychological. The state distributed pamphlets to parents with titles like "Krampus is an evil man," arguing that the figure was a source of anxiety and trauma for children. These modern-day assaults prove that the horned enforcer of the Alps was still considered a potent and dangerous cultural force, a subversive spirit that even 20th century governments felt a need to tame. After centuries of condemnation and ridicule, the old traditions found their salvation in a powerful intellectual and artistic movement that swept across Europe in the 19th century. The Romantic movement was a direct and passionate counter-reaction to the cold, mechanistic rationalism of the Enlightenment. The Romantics championed emotion, intuition, the sublimity of nature, and a deep reverence for the past. At the heart of this movement were scholars like Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm. Their famous collection of fairy tales was part of a much larger project of cultural preservation. They, and folklorists like them, were driven by a new idea, the concept of the Volksgeist, or the folk soul. This philosophy held that the truest, most authentic expression of a nation's character resided in the songs, stories, and traditions of its rural peasantry, rather than its high art or educated elites. The folklore that the Enlightenment had dismissed as embarrassing superstition was now reframed as a precious, uncorrupted artifact of a nation's soul. These stories were a direct link to a purer, pre-industrial, and uniquely German or Slavic or Celtic past. This intellectual shift was the lifeline that the winter spirits needed. Suddenly, they were no longer demons to be exorcised or follies to be mocked. They were valuable cultural treasures. Perchta was no longer a witch. She was a surviving echo of a powerful Germanic goddess. The Wild Hunt was reinterpreted, seen now as a powerful link to the great mythological cycles of the pre-Christian North. This new class of scholars and folklorists began to travel the countryside, diligently interviewing the last remaining storytellers and documenting the rituals that were on the verge of extinction. They collected, catalogued, and published these traditions, giving them a new and scholarly form of legitimacy. By placing them in books, they enshrined them in the cultural canon. This act of preservation saved the winter horrors from oblivion, transforming them from targets of shame into objects of national pride. The folklorists of the 19th century saved the winter spirits from extinction, placing them in a state of protected cultural preservation. For another century, they remained largely the domain of regional enthusiasts and academic specialists. But in the early 21st century, something changed. Thanks to the power of the internet and social media, these obscure alpine horrors went viral, and one figure in particular exploded into a global phenomenon: Krampus. This modern revival is driven by a deep and growing dissatisfaction with the contemporary American-style Christmas. Over the course of the 20th century, the holiday was relentlessly commercialized. Its rougher, more spiritual, and folkloric edges sanded away. Saint Nicholas, the stern but benevolent bishop, was transformed into Santa Claus, a jolly, perpetually laughing grandfather figure who brings gifts to everyone and judges no one too harshly. The result is a holiday of unabashed, almost mandatory cheeriness, a season of relentless consumerism and sentimentality. The darkness was written out of the story. The profound, ancient anxieties about the dying of the light, the fear of the wild, and the need for communal virtue were replaced by the much simpler anxiety of finding the right gift at the mall. Into this landscape of sanitized sweetness, Krampus re-emerged as a powerful countercultural icon. He is the anti-Santa. He brings punishment, not presents. He is raw, chaotic, and dangerous. He is a direct and thrilling repudiation of the holiday's commercial sentimentality. For many, his revival is an attempt to restore a sense of balance to Christmas, to reintroduce the darkness that gives the light its meaning. He is embraced as an anti-hero, a figure who allows for a more complex and authentic emotional response to the season. He represents a nostalgia for a grittier, more meaningful past, and his growing popularity is a testament to a collective desire for a holiday with higher stakes than just being naughty or nice. The global explosion of interest in Krampus, Perchta, and the other figures of the winter darkness is the final stage of their long survival. After centuries of being hunted, demonized, and dismissed, they have been resurrected by the very forces of modernity that once sought to destroy them. They have become symbols of authenticity in a commercialized world, icons of regional identity in a globalized one, and a welcome shadow in a landscape of overwhelming, artificial light. The story of Europe's dark winter traditions begins with a simple, primal fear. It is the fear of the dying of the sun, the tyranny of the cold, and the oppressive, suffocating darkness of the longest night. Faced with a hostile universe, our ancestors did what humanity has always done. They told stories. They took their anxieties, their fear of the storm, their dread of starvation, their need for social order, and they gave them a face. They gave the howling wind the face of a ghostly rider. They gave the law of the community the face of a horned enforcer. They gave the taboos of the sacred season the face of a winter hag with a sharpened knife. The wild hunt, Krampus, Perchta, and all the others are the product of this powerful act of personification. They are a way to make the abstract forces of chaos tangible, to give them a form that can be understood, appeased, or even fought. These figures have survived centuries of opposition because they serve a deep and enduring psychological need. They are archetypes, timeless expressions of the human relationship with darkness. They represent the necessary shadow that gives the firelight its meaning. They remind us that the world is not always safe, that order is a fragile achievement, and that the wild, untamable places still exist, both in the world and within ourselves. Even today, in our brightly lit, centrally heated world, these ancient figures retain their power. They are a connection to a past that was colder, darker, and more dangerous, but perhaps also more enchanted. They are a reminder that the great, foundational stories of humanity are not just about the triumph of the light, but about the wisdom and the terror that can only be found by staring, unflinching, into the primordial and beautiful darkness.